Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the Future Seeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. In this episode, I'm interviewing Santiago Siri. Santiago is an impressive man. He's primarily a programmer and has great skills in the blockchain technology. However, he's also an activist. In his country, Argentina, he tried participating in politics and has had terrible surprises, including a request for him to bribe a judge $100,000 in order to be able to present himself as a candidate. This led him to the conclusion that nation-states are too corrupted to be fixed. Hence, he co-founded Democracies, an NGO whose purpose is creating censorship-resistant digital democracies. I'll let you listen to the incredible political and technological genius he and his team are showing. If you're not skilled in IT yourself, don't panic. I'll try and keep the conversation as comprehensible as possible. I believe it is important for people to listen to this, as there's a revolution taking place that many are unaware of. Great to have you here today, Santiago. You're a very interesting man. I've read a lot about what you do, and you're the co-founder of the Partido del Red, a political party that ran in Argentina, Buenos Aires, and that was committed to people and their vote online with a platform that you yourself built to allow people to vote. And you're the founder of the Democracy Earth Foundation, and that's the reason you're here on this show today. It's a non-profit organization building open-source, censorship-resistant digital democracies. And it's backed by the Templeton Foundation, which is specifically a philanthropic organization who aims to support progress. And you're one of the only NGOs backed by Y Combinator, the famous business accelerator based in California. And if that wasn't enough, you're the partner of Bitex.la, the leading Bitcoin exchange in South America, based in Buenos Aires, and you're author of a book called Hacktivismo. And from what I can read, you're really all in what you do. Your baby girl, Roma Siri, was the first human being in history to be registered as a blockchain certified global citizen in 2015, and the birth video you recorded of her is now forever part of the legend. So Siri, welcome on the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I would say probably my daughter is my proudest achievement in all of that.
I understand. I really had so much fun reading your white paper. And when I say fun, I really mean the type of fun that only a geek can have. When you have to read sentences 3 times to understand them and you're just amazed by the complexity and the sophistication. So yeah, let's get into it. I'd like to start with the mission statement that's on your website. It says, we develop the building blocks for censorship-resistant democracy. So my first question is, what's the censorship issues you're referring to and are trying to solve?
So our thought when we started Democracy Earth, after the experience of doing politics in Argentina and trying to understand what democracy means in the information age, is, we ask ourselves, what would it take to create systems of governance that can be deployed anywhere there's an internet connection around the world? And throughout the last decade, we have seen the rise of new technologies like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are very interesting platforms to start creating on the internet a new kinds of institutions, new kinds of organizations. So we started working, with the open source movement, with all of those technologies that are out there that seem to indicate that the ethos of the internet is not just cultural or limited to making all of us broadcasters, but rather, like all information technologies before in history, it will also be a driver in terms of creating new kinds of institutions or reforming the way we think about human organizations. And I got interested in politics coming from a technology angle. I've been a programmer my whole life. The Partido de la Red was an incredible experience in Argentina that taught me a lot about how the system works today, what it takes to create a party, to run for elections, to put the ballots in the different polling centers and finally count the votes. and it's a very hard system to play with. It's a very hard system. It's a very corrupt system, especially in developing nations. You find a lot of corruption, a lot of violence, a lot of threats. To me, the years when I did politics in Argentina was probably the most exciting years of my life, but also the most frightening years. I had death threats all the time. I suffer from panic attacks. It's not easy to engage in those type of arenas, and technology offers an alternative. It offers us a new model that can make the existing model obsolete, and I like that idea of what these new technologies allow.
Right. And that's what you mean by censorship, all these different issues that arise when you try to run.
Yeah, well, the core aspect of governance technology that is able to move money around, or assets, or any type of good that you can put into put a subject of governance, is that in order for that technology to be something that is paradigmatically better than the nation state or corporations, which are the traditional entities of governance today, it needs to be something that can resist censorship from a Facebook, a Google, or the Chinese Communist Party, or Argentina,
Right.
or any nation state. So censorship resistance is a key attribute of decentralization. Decentralization is really a tactic to get towards that goal, and it's because of this property of immutability that you have in these distributed ledgers, that no one can tamper with what is printed on the blockchain, or whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum's. No one can corrupt those contents. That makes these technologies a much more interesting landscape for governance than traditional governments.
Right. I see your point. But this, I reckon our listeners are mostly non-technical, and so I'm going to try and describe what is it that you do at Democracy at Earth and the software you built, Sovereign, in really easy terms. So let's go very slowly, step by step, because it's quite technical in reality. But if I was to describe the simplest way to what Sovereign does, it's a platform for online voting.
Yeah, that's
Yes?
fair enough. Fair enough.
You built a software that can be used by any community or company. They can take it and install it for free for them, for their organization, and manage their own governance. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's an open source project, which means that the code is available for anyone to copy, to modify without even our permission, and you can adapt the tool to the governance needs of your organization. And more recently, we have been pretty much focused on this idea of DAOs built on top of Ethereum, which is probably what makes more sense when you think about governance in a digital environment.
Right. So this comes to the obvious question, which is, what's blockchain and why is all of this built on top of blockchain?
Well, blockchains, at the end of the day, they are ledgers, that are simply keeping account of how much money comes in and how much money goes out from a given address in that ledger. The innovation that Satoshi Nakamoto brought with his paper 10 years ago was a way of verifying transactions in that ledger in a way that you don't need to rely in a central authority. Historically, when we use paper money, even we are both tacitly, trusting the Federal Reserve of the United States, because we look at that paper and we see certain stamps and checks, and ultimately it is the Federal Reserve of the United States, or a central bank, which the entity that decides which of these bills are legitimate and which ones are fake. And that decision of verifying which transaction is true and which transaction is false is a very important problem to keep a legitimate economy up and running. So how you can do that without relying in a central authority, which can be corrupted, which can be, which can change the policy from one day to the other and make a whole market, unpredictable. So how you can do that without relying to a central authority? Well, the idea of Satoshi Nakamoto, he basically introduces the use of cryptography by creating a type of money that can be mined or cryptographically generated. So I don't want to go too much into the specifics of describing Bitcoin, but
yeah. So for all intents and purposes, I think with the thing with blockchain, what people talk about a lot is that they say it's uncorruptible and trackable.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it very interesting for many different applications. But based on what you just said now, because the way you explain it sounds very financial, economical. What's the link about that, what you just said, and voting?
So, voting is just another kind of transaction, but it's a political transaction rather than a financial one. And voting mostly relies on our ability to make sure that the right people come to vote. People that have that right to vote come to vote. That no single person votes two times. Preventing an identity from voting twice is very important. That the voting periods are respected. In many countries we see that suddenly the polls never end, and you see all kinds of attacks. And democracies are usually the most hostile environment in terms of systems, because the stakes are very high, and when the stakes are very high, you will find a lot of bad actors trying to corrupt the outcome of an election. So electronic voting, there's a lot of opinions around the subject, because it's true that also computation introduces complexity, and for a process that needs auditability, simplicity is desired. But you have cases, for example, in India, where they introduce electronic voting machines. India is the largest democracy in the world. They have 800 million voters. And since the introduction of electronic voting machines, which are simple calculators, they try to keep these machines as dumb as possible for the sake of auditability. Violence, it was, I think, until 94, an average of 200 people died on every election happening in India. And these are elections that happen through a period of 6 weeks, because it's a lot of voters. And technology helped reduce the number of deaths that happen on every election, and bring much more accountability to the process. Now, using computers or electronic voting in large voting systems might not be advisable to every country. Usually technology really works when it needs to solve something that needs scalability, that needs to handle millions and millions of voters, and not just a handful of thousands of voters. So that's why
people are usually afraid of electronic voting, but it's because usually it's not also based on blockchain and it doesn't have those properties of non-hackability.
My sensation with blockchain is that what we're seeing with the whole ecosystem around blockchain is that it's really an alternative to traditional governments or to traditional finance. What we're seeing with networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum is that they're trying to create an alternative to the nation state, in the sense that these are networks that don't require any kind of permit to run on any country or any place you set them up. You can spin up a Bitcoin or Ethereum node anywhere you have an internet connection around the world, and that node in itself will become the bureaucratic entity that will be verifying or validating the different transactions happening in the network. So I think that the internet, throughout since the 60s, since it got invented in the 60s, actually as a military defense strategy from the United States, because they were fearful of a nuclear attack. So they figured, let's do a decentralized network so a nuclear attack won't be able to hit a critical target, because no target will be critical as the information gets decentralized. Then we had the web, which was a cultural revolution that made every one of us anywhere in the world a broadcaster. And culture, we became more globalized than ever in terms of access to different cultures and access to different ideas from anywhere around the world. But like all information technologies before in history, the printing press or written form or even speech itself, the rise of a new information technology eventually leads to revolutionary change. And the revolutionary change, what is bringing a new notion of what institutions are from the internet, intrinsically from the internet, is the emergence of blockchain-based networks. Institutions fundamentally are a collection of promises. That's what all institutions are. And a bank is an institution that promises you that your money will be there tomorrow. But usually the way they have to guarantee you that promise is through the use of force and some kind of authority attached to that force. The government has the police, has the military, and so you will trust them because you have no option, you have no leverage against that kind of force. This is a soft kind of trust. Through the use of cryptography and mathematics, we can start storing promises in a hard way through the use of computation, distributed networks, and huge amount of energy and computation being put at the service of protecting these networks. And cryptography, technically speaking, it is considered a weapon, actually, under U.S. legislation. Cryptographic technology is technology that can be very serious in the outcome of a war. Cryptography actually won the Second World War more than the atomic bomb probably did. It was Turing machines decrypting the Nazis that did the trick to put the Allies in advantage in that war. So now cryptography is becoming personal, just like computers did over the last 3 decades, just like the internet did in the last couple of years. And as cryptography becomes personal, this idea of myself becoming my own sovereign, my own, I can control my own assets and no one has, I'm the one that has the last word about what to do with my assets, is the incredible promise delivered by this new technology, which is still in its infancy. There's a lot of experimentation going on. Everything, even Bitcoin itself, I would argue, is still an experiment. But it has a tremendous potential of being a complete new alternative to nation states entirely.
It's really amazing stuff, and I think it's quite mind-boggling for people because it's such cutting edge, it's such at the intersection between politics and technology, which for some people might be weird. I'm going to come back a bit to what you were just saying when you're explaining why voting makes sense in these systems, which are at the moment primarily used for finance. Because if I try to recap what you said, there's a lot of the properties of what voting is that blockchains happen to be ensuring, like you were saying, not having a double spend, not 2 people voting, etc. But you don't, in your system anyway, you chose to go with a type of voting which is not the usual type of voting that we're used to, where one person is one vote. You're going with something called quadratic voting. Could you explain what quadratic voting is?
Yes, we actually tried every version of democracy you can think of. We did direct democracy, participatory budgeting, liquid democracy, you name it. Quadratic voting is probably one of our latest iterations. It's an idea first published by Glenn Weil in 2012. He's a very well-known researcher from Princeton. And the idea of quadratic voting is that, let's say everyone gets 100 tokens and you have to vote over many issues. But when you put 1 vote in an issue, that will cost you 1 token. But when you put 2 votes in an issue, rather than that costing you 2 tokens, it will cost you quadratically. So it will cost you 4 tokens. If you put 3 votes in the issue, it will cost you 9 tokens. If you put 4 votes in an issue, it will cost you 16 tokens. So the cost increases quadratically the more you bet on an idea. So you as a voter, the system is really weighing two things. On one hand, your preferences, and on the other hand, the intensity of those preferences. So as a voter, you can either put all of your energy in the issue you care a lot about, or you can distribute and make a small impact across many issues. So you are confronted with this choice of strong preferences versus weak preferences, and it is through that that you are allowed to have a system that can really it can really help organizations discover where the consensus is in more ways than just finding the favorite issue.
Yeah, and there's another issue you're talking about. I think in your paper you said the following statement. It's important to state that we're not aiming for a democratic system based on mob rule or majoritarism. History offers sufficient examples on how a blind majority can end up failing the aspirations of a republic, often putting demagogues in power. So could you explain to our listeners what are the caveats of basing our democracies on the simple notion of majority and how quadratic voting helps solving this issue?
So, first of all, I in my experience on every single pilot that we have done with different democratic models, everything has a failure. Everything has a blind side, a blind spot, and there's no simple one formula to rule them all. And it all depends on the challenges of the decision, the constituency. There are many factors that can influence a collective decision process. That said, simple majority voting, more often than not, you will find 20% of the people, very with strong preferences on the left, and 20% of people with strong preferences on the right, and 40% of the people, which might be the swing votes, that can, sometimes they go to the left, sometimes they go to the right. And you always have in electoral processes, this situation of this situation where, it's the weak preferences of the many versus the strong preferences of the few. And usually this intensity of preferences is rarely captured. So having a system that is able to capture this intensity through this quadratic formula, and according to the papers I've seen about the subject, it is exactly the quadratic formula which is able to achieve this, at least from a game theoretic point of view, might offer much more insight into what a constituency wants. According to Glenn, which is a close collaborator of ours, and we work very closely, this is a kind of system that will help empower minorities across a society more, as they will be able to organize better into defending their cause. But we have to see still many more implementations about this type of new novel ideas around how a democratic system can work in real context, and that's very hard to find, a place that is willing to change the rules. We were able to do an implementation with the state of Colorado last year and work with the Democratic Party in the Colorado State House, and that led us to finding, the year before they did participatory budgeting, which is basically they gave 15 tokens to everyone and they just allocate the tokens. And they ended up with 60 to 70% of the proposals having the same amount of tokens. So they were not able to discern the long tail of preferences across 100 bills that they were trying to prioritize. They were able probably to identify the top 2 or the top 5, and that's it. When we implemented quadratic voting with them last year in 2019, we were able to have an organic distribution of the preferences of each one of the 107 bills that they were voting on. So we were able to identify not only the top 1, top 2, 3, 4, but actually all 107. Only 2 or 3 had the same amount of tokens. And this kind of organic distribution of preferences, it seems to be, according to all of the research that we have seen, an interesting property that emerges from a quadratic voting mechanism.
One thing is that, from what I understand, it's like if you know that it's going to cost you more, then you're more careful with what you vote for.
Right. You have more, and actually this has been measured in some pilots. We have seen pilots where you have a traditional voting system and a quadratic voting system with the same type of ballot. And the ballot is usually typical survey ballot where you have strongly disagree, strongly agree, and some neutral point in the middle, and you have to choose. And with quadratic voting, what happens is that people go back more and review their decisions more, because the more they want to support an idea, it will have a larger opportunity cost with other ideas, because it is more expensive to strongly support an idea under the quadratic voting context. So you either probably are gonna go all into the one cause you really care about, or diversify across many issues. And it's up to every voter. But this is, it is, of all of the mechanisms that we have made pilots on, not only researched, but actually implemented and tested with a real constituency and figured out what happens, quadratic voting does seem to be the most promising idea out there for collective decision making.
Love it. It's quite an interesting idea. Decoupling between one person, one vote, making it's that layer where you make it more abstract. And
there's something that Vitalik Buterin said that I really like, that in Western democracies we have this notion that you either have $1 one vote systems and one person one vote systems, meaning the financial world and the political world. But in reality, everything is more of a spectrum. Nothing needs to be exactly $1 one vote or one person one vote. It can be much more into a continuum. And it is in this continuum that I think that there's a lot of room for new possibilities, new innovations in game theory and in smart contracts to explore. And that's one of the most interesting aspects of what's going on with Ethereum and some of these blockchain projects out there.
That's very interesting for sure. All right, I'd like to get just a tiny bit, because that's my geek side, into the nitty-gritty of how your system works. I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand it. But from what I understand, your system at the moment works that if someone joins the system, he starts earning value, earning tokens, just by the simple fact that he's part of this system. I think it's what you call the hour token. Just by the fact that he's basically digitally alive, he starts earning value.
This is something that we're actually still researching. We have implemented the hour token as a way of, funding our research. But one of the main challenges we have at Democracy Earth, and I think it's one of the main challenges in the blockchain space, is understanding how you formalize identity in a decentralized way. So if you look at what has disrupted democracy in the last decade, mainly being social media, and especially Facebook, the reason Facebook became so relevant is because ultimately they are the largest centralized repository of human identities in the world. And through that network, a lot of information goes through, and it's, people rely on Facebook's ability to keep account on 2.8 billion humans that are connected to their network. So identity is a very important thing. How you can do a system of identity in a way that you don't become Facebook, or in a way that you don't become Big Brother or an Orwellian nightmare like what happened with the web. And that's the point of decentralization. So how does identity play out in a decentralized context? So that's what we, at Democracy Earth, and along with some other organizations, we call as how to deliver a proof of humanity protocol. A protocol that where if you can prove that you're a living human being and you don't hold keys to the system or to the network already, then you have certain rights enabled for you. The killer application of that, democracy is one of them. Universal basic income could be another one of them. There are multiple applications that can be deployed, social applications that can be deployed once you figure out the proof of humanity problem. To this day, with the Templeton Foundation, they have funded us to research on this. We have been working with other teams that are looking into the same problem from different angles. There are different techniques. Some projects try to use Turing tests. Other projects try to use a web of trust where everyone vouches for everyone else. But each one of these approaches has some trade-offs on how these networks can effectively prove humanity without having civil participants or duplicated participants in the network. So it remains an open problem. We have at Democracy Earth created the Hour token as a first step to, along the lines of eventually going in the direction of trying to create a UBI mechanism. But this proof of humanity problem remains open, and it's a big challenge that we're working with a lot of projects in the Ethereum space and some other independent projects that are trying to crack this problem. That is a critical component if we want to think about democracies that we can deploy over the internet in a censorship-resistant way. I don't feel that we have a close answer to those, but we have some interesting primitives we can work with. Democracy Earth, we have worked on the different primitives. One primitive is, well, if you have a proof of humanity protocol, then you can have a token that is minted by each valid identity every hour, and you just can make a labor-based coin that rewards everyone according to their time.
According to their time, right? And then you can spend it for voting.
Yeah. Then there's the quadratic voting element, which is a mechanism of decision making among many mechanisms. In particular, what our software today is pretty much, we are taking the software in the direction of turning it into a tool that allows anyone to create, explore, and interact with DAOs. We see that the concept of DAOs is a very relevant way of creating human organizations on the blockchain that can create decision-making processes in a transparent way that anyone can audit, that anyone can participate on these organizations. So these are all different.
We don't have enough time to get into that, but basically for the listeners, you can store promises, you can store contracts within the system blockchain, and you can somehow, sometimes automate it as well.
Yeah, we use a template contract called Moloch, which is it's the simplest smart contract in terms of lines of code. It's only 400 lines of code that it has been able to deliver the most value for the Ethereum ecosystem over the last year. Moloch has something like, it's a DAO in itself, the Moloch DAO. It has, I think it's 55 members, something like that, or 60. And it has a budget of $1.5 million. And it has, over the period of 1 year, it has given over 120 grants, small and large, to fund different initiatives that advance the development of the Ethereum protocol. And that's, what we like about Moloch is that it's super simple in terms of lines of code. It's only 400 lines of code. It has some game theoretic tweaks that reduce the risk on participating in this entity. You can leave at any given moment. And at the same time, it helps, it makes decisions in a collective way where everyone votes. But at the same time, a way of participating is actually not participating because you already trust the members that are participating in the decisions, unless there's a decision that is contentious. And, well, in those cases, participation levels do increase. But these are experiments on governance that are happening right now. And,
very current stuff.
Yeah, we're proud to be a part of that and contribute ideas to the improvement of that.
It's so amazing. Once again, it's so cutting edge. I hope our non-technical listeners can follow. In an interview you did for the Unchained podcast, you said you're imagining what it would take to deploy a democracy over the internet that is censorship resistant, that is fair, and help us to think a governance in a borderless way, in a post-nation state mindset. So could you tell us a bit what you're imagining when you say that governance should and will be borderless and transcend the notion of nation states?
Well, I think that's probably a reality for many who have been experiencing the use of something like Bitcoin over the last 10 years. There's this thing with Bitcoin that, I have friends escaping from Venezuela that told me about how they saw, people from the government, military men confiscating gold from the bag of other families that were trying to escape the country, that, they had all their savings in golden stuff or physical stuff or, cash, simple cash. and all of that gets confiscated at the airport. And my friend, who has been working on the crypto space for the last 5-6 years, he was very thankful because he was able to leave his country with all of his assets simply hidden in a passphrase inside his mind. And he arrived to Argentina and was able to, without having a bank account, without having, still back then, now he already has the proper papers, but he didn't even have the legal documentation to be living in Argentina. But he had Bitcoin. He has a technology that allowed him to make that decision of moving elsewhere. I experienced that myself. In the last 7 years, I lived in 4 different cities, and I was able to move around the world. And the issue of moving my money around was never really an issue. And this kind of technology that simply cannot be captured by any traditional entity, by any state. You can cross borders technically with millions of dollars hidden inside your mind and no one can do anything about it. It's such a fundamentally new landscape for how power plays out, that I think that it's important that when we look at these networks, that we try to understand, once these networks gain more maturity, have more impact in the world, how will these networks get governed? Because until today, still, if you look into the blockchain space, everything is pretty much plutocratic. Everything is, whoever has the largest stake is the one that is probably able to upgrade how a protocol works. So our concern coming from Democracy Earth is, well, how we can make sure that these new institutional technologies can face society and can face society in a democratic way where all the constituents are heard and we find mechanisms that can even be much more reliable and better than the traditional first past the post democracies that have been operating for the last 200 years.
Yeah, just to make it very clear, when you say post-nation state mindset and borderless governance, the example you gave though sounds more like borderless finance more than borderless governance. When someone says borderless governance, I imagine a way of taking decisions and voting globally. The example you gave was more finance. So I'd like to know if you're imagining a world in which those systems, there is sort of a local and statewide and national structures for voting and taking decisions, or if it's all flat and horizontal.
Well, I certainly try to explore the route of working with traditional governments, and it's a very hard game to work. And my sensation with that is that before you can change anything about the system will end up changing you, and it's just that powerful. But we can start creating some alternatives. I agree that until today, probably the whole blockchain space has been fundamentally about finance and about efficiency in the markets. But the discussions around governance have been evolving and maturing over the last 3 or 4 years. I'd say that in an ecosystem like Ethereum, there are very interesting debates around what's good governance, what's bad governance, and some interesting experiences and pilots that have been implemented. I'm particularly at Democracy Earth right now. We're paying a lot of attention to what is known as DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations. These are basically cooperatives or entities that have multiple participants that lock down a budget inside this entity and decide how to spend this budget through weekly votes or different governance mechanisms that they can vary in the mechanics, they can vary in the game theory about how the decision process happens. And there are definitely a lot of very interesting ideas in the field of game theory that are being implemented on smart contracts that are running on Ethereum. And I think we are still pretty much in the very early days, but something like a DAO that has participants from all over the world, that you don't necessarily need to show your passport or show your identity, or even you can even participate anonymously in a DAO. These are transnational entities that eventually in the future they can be very efficient coordination mechanisms that can allocate funds in a global way, in ways that no single government can do. for example, in the COVID-19 crisis, there's a lot of people out there trying to build ventilators, trying to build, buying meals for the doctors, and those types of entities that can coordinate that. Sometimes it doesn't need to be a government. It can be something as simple as a DAO or something like that.
So we're getting to towards the end of this interview. I want to ask actually less technical questions. I made an interview with Lynn Carson, who is a professor in politics and specialized in deliberative democracy. And I was lucky enough to be part of one of those deliberative experiments. And so she is a bit more aged than us. She's seen a lot more different systems, more paper-based, I guess, and she didn't have much faith in technology and how it can support democracy. But do you think that, because the way she sees it is, if you put people together in a room and get them to deliberate, debate and discuss, a very heterogeneous group, you actually give yourself the permission to believe in a human being, to be able to debate and discuss and harness the intelligence of the collective group. And so she was seeing, a lot of direct democracy online as more like opinion polls and non-constructed ideas, and non-constructed criticism, and just, that type of voting. Whereas when you have a group of people discussing together, you construct, you build people's thought, and then they can vote and you get very different results. What's your take on that? Is it incompatible, the types of system that you're building, and the fact of really getting humans together to build criticism?
I don't see, what is people in a room? People in a room can also be people on social media constantly ranting about the same thing every day. Probably I have improved my cognition and understanding about the issues that I care about, like, crypto, Ethereum, or Bitcoin, which is the kind of stuff that I follow on Twitter, much more by the debates that I've been having throughout the last 5 years on social media than, probably in a conference or in a meeting room where you can have if you're lucky enough, you will have interesting encounters with very smart people. But in the long run, the most interesting debates, the most interesting arguments, sometimes, of course, social media can be nasty, or, it can push you to trolling levels of misery with others, which is not good. But I guess in a certain point, it all depends on how you react and act with others. But I think debate can happen anywhere. It doesn't need to be literally people in the same room or in the same parliament. But I do think that there's a lot of things about governance that escape the simple manual or the simple rules or the what is written in the contract. The art of politics is definitely more than that, and that does have to do with the real world. With your ability to move around and your ability to connect with others. And be present where it matters to be present. That will never be able to be replaced by technology. So technology is simply a tool, and we have to know how it can empower us, but we have to not lose track that at the end of the day we are members of a community, and we have families, we have and that real aspect of the real world is always going to be there, and hopefully technology can help make things better, but at the end of the day, it's up to us as humans with other humans. So I agree with her also. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, I had another interview with a world-class environmentalist, Helena Lebehaj, and she has more concerns about, being dependent on heavy technology, being dependent on very specialized technical stuff. That was another concern I heard.
Yeah, I would say that today probably the elite emerging from the whole blockchain movement is not that it's a super democratic movement in itself. It's really, we are replacing politicians with programmers. And, programmers can be as elitist as politicians and bankers. It's just a new kind of knowledge, a new kind of power. A new generation understands that other generations don't. And in that sense, there's a transfer of power. So I think it's a huge responsibility for the big load of 20-year-olds out there that are building these new tools, these new technologies of governance, of finance. It's a huge responsibility to understand how we can make sure that these new tools don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and we can understand how these new tools can in effect become much more inclusive. I have no doubt that something like YouTube is probably much more inclusive in terms of broadcasting than traditional television. Anyone can become a YouTuber or can post content and share videos, and whatever your thing is, your creativity has a place in that. So technology does open the space, but at the same time it consolidates new kings, right? It consolidates new elites. After all, YouTube is a Google property, and Google pretty much runs everything we see on the internet. So that new structure of power, how it's gonna look, I would say today blockchain is pretty elitist in many ways. My concern in the blockchain world is how to make it more democratic, and if we can make that more
elitist and young.
Elitist and young.
It's a lot of young people.
Very young people, 20, 21, 25, 22. I'm an old guy in the conferences. I'm 36.
How old are you? 36, okay.
36, so I'm already an old guy, and I noticed that in the conferences. But yeah, it's
it's a very interesting topic, this transfer of power.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so I have one last question for you, and it can take you only 30 seconds to a minute. I want to give you space right now, Santiago. If you have a message that you'd like to send to the world, to our listeners, something that touches you, that reaches you about the work that you do.
Well, democracy is always a work in progress. It's never a complete idea. Otherwise, it would be a totalitarian concept like any other of the other ideologies that are out there. So it's a long fight for democracy, but I think we have to be certain that the good thing about it is that it's a task that never ends, and it can cover every aspect of our life. So that keeps me going every day. And thank you very much. Very nice interview. I really enjoyed it. Sad that I have to leave now, but happy to do one more in the future.
The honor was mine. With great pleasure, we'll do another episode. The Future Seeds podcast is a project that is supported by its community of listeners. If you like the show and what it stands for, I invite you to head to www.futureseeds.news, where you can support the show for just $2 a month, be part of the Future Seeds community, connect with its amazing members and speakers, and enable this podcast to thrive. I thank you for your time and hope you enjoy the show and its exploration of alternative solutions to the world's greatest challenges.